Welcome to another video about filmmaking, photography and the creative work behind, and to the Fujifilm XT4 Masterclass. As I already announced it a few times, this video will be all about the Fujifilm XT4. However, you can also apply a lot of these informations and tricks to any other Fujifilm camera and other camera brands if you will. Just to tell you in the beginning, this whole masterclass is a bit more focused on the video side of the camera because I do a lot more video production, but I also got some helpful informations and settings for photography in here. I tell you everything I learned and experienced after working with this camera over the last 11 months, and you'll find links to every product I talk about in the video description, and with a purchase to these links you can give me a little support to my work and my channel. And now let's start with the masterclass, because this video is going to be long enough anyway. Besides the camera, the most important thing, and sometimes more important than the camera itself, are the lenses. Lenses come in different focal lengths with different apertures, stabilizations and so much more. In the following, I will tell you about the different possibilities you have when it comes to buying new lenses. First off, we have our native Fuji lenses. If you made the good choice and chose a kit lens with your camera, you already got a native Fujifilm lens in your hands. That is the perfect way to step into the game. The 18 to 55mm Fuji kit lens is one of the best kit lenses I've ever worked with, and you can get some awesome results with it. However, if you want to expand your equipment by buying lenses with different focal lengths, there are also some options you can choose from. You can also go with one of the amazing third-party brands who develop lenses for the Fujifilm FX mount. You can use these lenses without any adapter to your camera. Brands like Viltrox, 7 Artisans, TT Artisans and Samyang do a great job when it comes to low budget but good working lenses. For example, the Viltrox lenses, which are mostly just half the price, sometimes also got better autofocus than its native Fujifilm competitor. I already tested a few of these third-party lenses and got some videos on the channel if you want to check them out. One more alternative, which I use the most of the time, is adapting lenses with different mounts to your camera. I have connected my Sigma 18-35 f1.8, which is a Canon EF lens, to my Fujifilm X4 with the help of the Fringer EF2 FX Pro 2. With this adapter you can use a ton of good Canon EF lenses on your Fujifilm camera, even with working autofocus. And that gives you tons of possibilities because the lens choice of Canon EF glass is huge. I made a test video about the adapter and my favorite Fujifilm X4 setup, including the Sigma 18-35. With other adapters, you can also connect old vintage lenses like Minolta or old Canon glass to your Fujifilm camera and get a really nice characteristic look to your footage. It's not easy to talk about accessories in general because it really depends on what you are planning to shoot with your camera. I will start with the basics and then we go more into detail and talk about what could be useful for you when you want to specify in different areas. The most important accessory is by far the SD card, where you save all your video footage and stills. For filming in 4K 400 megabytes per second, which is the highest setting in the X4 can natively film in, it's very important to have fast SD cards. Besides that, it's very useful when they are big enough to save a lot of data. I use 128GB SanDisk Extreme Pro with 170 megabytes per second and a really fast 64GB 300 megabytes per second SD card. With these two SD cards I never had any problems and I always had enough space for a whole day of shooting. The next very important accessory are batteries. On a full production day I bring 4 batteries for the X4 with me, which carried me through a full shooting day without worrying about my battery life. To save some money, I really can recommend third-party batteries like Baxter. You get 2 batteries and dual charger, which is very useful for a price of 1 Fujifilm battery, and I never experienced any problems with the batteries from Baxter. ND filters are a more essential tool as you might expect in the beginning of your career. Believe me, I made the same mistake. I use variable ND filters, which allows me to keep my shutter speed where it should be for filming and made me able to film with fast apertures like f1.8. I use a more expensive ND filter from Tiffen and a low price alternative from Gope, and actually even expensive variable ND filters, even the Peter McKinnon variable ND filter, have a small color shift, but that's totally normal and you can easily compensate this in color grading. Besides that, there are filters which I use for stylistic reasons, but not necessary for the technical correctness like ND filters. For example, I use a Tiffen Black Pro Mist, which softens the image a little bit and gives it a more cinematic look. There are a ton of other stylistic filters which you can use to create a very unique look of your footage. When you use your X-T4 for filming and you want to step up your audio game, you can improve the quality by using different microphones. I use the Rode VideoMic NTG straight on my camera to catch atmosphere sound, or if my subject is not far away from the camera and the surrounding sound isn't that loud. If you want to catch good audio in an interview situation or speeches, you can use a lavalier microphone which records to an external recorder or with a transmitter straight to the camera. This is perfect for eliminating every disturbing surround sound and focusing on the voice of your subject. For bigger productions where I need higher video quality and a lot of data storage, I use my Atomos Ninja 5. This is a recorder and monitor which allows you to save your footage directly to an SSD and lets you film in a better codec like ProRes. We talk a little bit more about codecs later in this video, but to keep it simple, let's say it gives you more flexibility in post-production and it's more easier to work with than the video codecs from the X-T4. When you plan to film long and smooth camera movements, a gimbal is necessary for your camera. It's a motorized stabilization system which compensates the shakes from your body while filming. But I personally don't like working with a gimbal and I do as much as I can in handheld, but there are definitely some situations where a gimbal comes in very handy. And there's a lot more accessories which you can add to your equipment like camera rigs, following focus systems and so much more. Talking about everything would extend this video more than required, and you don't need this for a nice beginning with your camera. In this part in the video, we jump straight into the camera. I will tell you about what I think are the most important settings for taking high quality stills, different shooting modes, and how I work with the top dials of the X-T4. This part is not me explaining every single setting in your camera. I just inform you about the settings I use all the time and which are important to know. So let's jump into the menu to tell you about the most important photography settings for your Fujifilm camera. If you want to do a lot of editing with your stills, you should set your image quality to RAW. You can also choose RAW plus Fine if you want to keep the JPEG files in the highest quality and use them straight for your Instagram stories. If you just have a small SD card, you can also go with normal quality, then you get smaller files. Same thing for RAW recording. I always go with uncompressed because I want to use the full potential of my images, but if you just have a small SD card, go with the compressed and you're totally fine. With the film simulations and these effect settings, you can shoot some awesome looking JPEGs with nice Fujifilm colors straight out of cam. We'll talk about that later in the video. Next important setting is the white balance. I just leave this on auto all the time because when shooting RAW, you can always set the white balance in post and the camera is really good at choosing the right white balance in auto mode. You can use the dynamic range feature to get some more information in highlights and shadows at the same time, but just keep in mind that you also increase your base ISO when increasing the dynamic range. The autofocus and manual focus settings really depend on your personal shooting style and how much control you want and need about what is in focus. When you shoot a lot of portrait stuff, you can always go with the autofocus and turn on the face and eye detection if the lens you're using supports autofocus. I really like to have full control over my focus and do manual focus most of the time, and it feels a lot more like being the photographer than let the camera do everything. So I really recommend mastering the manual focus because it definitely makes you a professional with your camera system. If you choose to go with manual focus, I can really recommend you using the manual focus assist and turn on the focus peaking. On the right outside corner, you got the exposure compensation dial. When you set your ISO, aperture and shutter speed to automatic mode, you can use this dial to let your camera know if you want the picture to be under or overexposed. In relation to your exposure level, the camera will set the right ISO, aperture and shutter for you. Besides that, you get the shutter speed dial and some additional settings. The A is the automatic mode, which let the camera set the shutter speed for you. B allows you to do longer exposure times, and T lets you control the shutter speed with another dial on the back, which is pretty useful. On the left side you got the ISO dial, which also got the automatic mode. In addition to that, you can set the ISO dial to C, which also lets you control the ISO with the dial on front of the camera. Underneath the ISO dial you get different shooting modes. HDR creates high dynamic range pictures with a lot of details in bright and dark areas. S is a single shot mode. CL and CH is continuous shooting in low and high, which is perfect for capturing fast movement. BKT is the bracketing mode, where the camera shoots pictures with different settings. For example, in exposure bracketing, you can stack these pictures together in post, which is quite useful, for example, for real estate photography, to get a nice exposure for inside and outside areas. With the advanced mode, you can add different stylistic filters to your stills, which are actually really ugly. So I never used any of these. And last but not least, with the panorama mode, you can shoot different pictures which create a larger image when stitched together in post. Okay, now let's talk about these film simulations and settings like grain effect and so on. With that, you can set up your custom profiles and create some really nice stuff straight out of cam. If you need more information on how you can use these settings, I can really recommend you checking out my video about the Fujifilm JPG Recipes. I will link it in the upper corner right here, I think, or in the video description. Now we do the same step we did for the photography settings, but optimized for taking videos with the Fujifilm X-T4. Again, I will not tell you about every single setting. Instead, I show you my preferred video settings to get the most out of the video footage. But as always, these settings aren't the only or the perfect way how to do this. It's just how I like to work with this camera and how I got some really great results with it. In the movie mode, you can set your desired resolution, frame rate and data rate. I always shoot in 4K 25 FPS for real time or 50 FPS if I need some slow motion, and keep my data rate to 200 megabytes per second. If you live in the US, for example, I would recommend you go with 23.98 FPS for real time and 59.94 for slow motion footage. I personally love to film 4K, not because of the high resolution, but to keep me some flexibility in cropping the image in post when exporting on a full HD timeline. Next one is the file format, which is kind of tricky. Normally I always choose the highest codec, which is MOV H.265, which gives you a clean 10-bit color range image, but the H.265 isn't really easy to handle in Premiere Pro, so sometimes I chose the MOV H.264 codec, which is easier to work with, but don't give you as much color grading flexibility like the H.265 10-bit codec. If you use an additional recorder like the Atomos Ninja 5, the camera can also film in ProRes 10-bit 422, which is the highest quality you can get out of this camera. This is my favorite codec to work with in post-production because it's very easy to handle for most editing software and gives you much more information for color grading. For movie compression, I choose long GOP because all intra wouldn't allow me to film 50p in 4K. If you need higher frame rates for crazy slow motions, you can turn on the full HD high speed recording and film up to 240 FPS, which is like a 10 times slow motion, but I can really recommend sticking with 200 frames per second maximum because with 240 frames the image gets a little soft. Next important setting is the F-Log HLG recording. I set this to F-Log recording on SD and HDMI. With that you get a flat color profile which gives you more flexibility in color grading and a higher dynamic range in your video footage. But you can also work with the awesome Fujifilm color profiles like Eterna and Classic Chrome if you don't want to do a lot of color grading in post-production and need great results straight out of camera. We skip the next settings and jump over to the IBIS mode. When I do smooth B-roll shots or small camera pans, I always keep the IBIS on, but just IBIS, not additional DIS. To get rid of my natural shakes, but really often I also turn off the IBIS completely. The natural handheld look is a real cinematic look in my opinion, and when you want to do some dynamic shots, the turned off IBIS is necessary to avoid ugly wobbles. Next one is Zebras, which I always use as an exposure tool. For more information and tools which I use for the correct exposure in video mode, you can check out the video which you can see in the upper corner or in the video description box below. This video is very helpful when you need some tips about which tools you can use for correct exposure and what is important to get some really nice skin color exposure. Movie optimized control, definitely turn this on. It makes filming a lot easier for you and lets you use the front and back dials for setting the shutter speed, aperture and ISO instead of using the top dials. I mean, the top dials look really great, but they are not very handy when filming. Last but not least, we got the custom settings where you can save and edit your favorite color profiles. When filming an F-Log color profile, I set my sharpness to -3 to get rid a little of the digital sharpness and keep the high ISO noise reduction on 0. White balance I always keep on auto because I always lock my white balance before shooting, that the camera will not change the white balance while filming. The focus settings really depends on what focus mode you prefer and what lens you are using. You have to know which lens is reliable in which situation and what you're going to shoot. It's the same as I already told you in the photography settings. Master the manual focus, even more important in video mode, to get as professional as possible with your camera. Otherwise, you can use the autofocus continuous if you have a good autofocus lens and want to keep a person in focus. Just try out some different settings and get a feeling for the camera and in what situations you can rely on the autofocus. We already talked about the different color profiles and maybe you made an opinion which is your favorite. For filming with the X-T4 you have the same possibilities by using these color profiles, but you can also use F-Log. Log profiles are really flat color profiles which gives you a higher dynamic range, more details in highlights and shadows, and more color grading flexibility in post-production. If you want to get the most out of your video footage and like to learn more about color grading, I would recommend you to stick with F-Log and learn how to use it because you can get some really awesome results with it. But if you don't need the dynamic range and don't like putting too much work into good looking video footage, you can always go with the regular color profiles like Eterna or Classic Chrome. Just try them and find what you like the most. In situations where it is already really dark or I need some good looking video footage straight out of camera, I also go with Eterna or Classic Chrome sometimes. If you want to use Eterna or Classic Chrome as your go-to profile, I can recommend you some settings to get some more flexibility in post for color grading. Go to the image quality settings and set your tone curve to -2 and -2, color -2, sharpness -3. With these settings you still got the nice color profile like Eterna or Classic Chrome, but you also have a more flat image, you get some more dynamic range and get rid a bit of the digital sharpness. Setting up the function buttons. With the XT4 you can set some different function buttons, which makes it much easier to work with this camera. I show you where I set my functions and why. Go in the menu to setup, button, dial setting and to function buttons. On function button 1 I got my AF settings. There I can change between zone focus and face or ID tracking with one click. Function button number 2 is my F-Log View Assist to see a converted image of my F-Log profile, and it's much easier to see your correct exposure and white balance. Function button number 3 is my white balance lock function. Very important and nice to use. Let the camera set the white balance by itself and lock it to be safe during filming. Function button number 4 are my different color profiles which I can choose from in stills mode. Function button number 5 is my custom white balance if I want to set it to a specific color temperature when working with different video lights and stuff like this. Function button number 6 are my saved custom profiles for some nice JPEG photography recipes. And the T function button number 1 is my histogram, which I can turn on and off when wiping on the screen. And the T function button number 2 are my zebras. I turn them on to check my exposure and turn them off when they disturb me. In this part of the masterclass video, I will tell you everything about how to do the real shooting of a video and which steps I do before hitting the record button. When doing sequences of filming like telling a story for a commercial or anything similar, I start with the widest lens and working myself through to the highest focal length I have. But this always depends on what kind of video you're going to shoot. Talking about shutter speed, ISO and aperture, I will not tell you the basics and how these work together. But most important is try to keep your shutter speed the double of your frame rate. So filming in real time 25 FPS, I set my shutter speed to 1/50th of a second, and when filming in 50 FPS for slow motion, I set my shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. Try to keep your ISO always as low as possible to avoid ISO noise. If you want to get some nice separation between your subject and the background, choose lenses with a fast aperture like f2 or f1.8 and use an ND filter to compensate brightness when shooting in daylight or bright areas. Like I said before, let the XT4 do its great work by setting the white balance by itself, hit the white balance lock function and you're good to go. Most of the time the camera does a really good job with setting the white balance by itself, and when I want to go for a specific color temperature, I change my white balance manual by Kelvin. I go with manual focus most of the time because I really like the manual focusing work and it feels more like the correct way of filmmaking for me. To get a little technical support from the camera, I turn on my focus peaking, go in the menu AF MF settings, and there you will find the MF assist and turn the focus peaking highlight to a color which is not often to see. I always choose between the red low and red high setting. The focus peaking now will show you a red glance around the area or subject which is in focus. When you have to shoot interviews or want to track a person while moving around, I would suggest you to go with the eye tracking and face detection in autofocus mode. But please check your lens autofocus ability before you use this in an important situation. As far I can tell right now, there are some lenses, even Fujifilm native lenses, which have a really bad autofocus and some which have great autofocus. Even third-party brands like Viltrox got some really nice autofocus features and are pretty reliable. For the autofocus continuous custom settings, I got my tracking sensitivity at +2 and autofocus speed at -3. But this also depends on the situation and how fast you want your subject to be tracked. I know these are a lot of informations and it's a lot of settings to consider when you want to get the most out of your camera. But the more often you shoot with your camera, you will get better and find the settings you like to create some awesome video footage and stills. And always keep in mind, shooting videos and photography is art, so there is no wrong or right. If you like your results and you feel good when working with the tools the camera gives you, it's the right way. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the post-production workflow for video editing. I already made a video about this topic, and that's why I just want to talk about the export settings now. If you need further information about sequence settings and my workflow, check out the video in the description box. I export my videos in H.264 most of the time and change some settings from default. Just double check the resolution you're going to export, check maximum bit depths, and then go down to bit rate. I increase my bitrate and go with something around 40 or 50 Mbps. On the bottom you can check use maximum render quality and use previews and then hit export. And that's it, friends, you made it. Hopefully you liked my masterclass video and I could help you with some informations in this video to get a better content creator with your Fujifilm X-T4 or whatever camera you use. Always keep in mind that it is a long process to increase skills and get better in your craft. So don't rush and always keep shooting to get better in video production or photography. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments and I try to help you as much as I can. Thank you for stopping by on my channel. Hopefully see you in the next video. Bye und auf Wiedersehen.